everybody is in. So good evening, everyone. My name is Jenny, and I'm with Anderson's Bookshop, and I'd like to welcome you to this Anderson's Bookshop virtual author event tonight with Claire Lombardo in conversation with Jennifer Weiner. We're really glad to have both of you authors with us and all of our guests with us tonight as well. I know it's election day here in our Chicago area for local elections, so hopefully you've all gone and voted and done your civic duty, and now you can kick back and relax while you wait for results to come in with this really fun event tonight. But thank you for taking the time to keep your eyes on another screen. I know it's been a year plus that we've been doing these virtual events, but trust me when I say that they are better. Doing this is better than sitting in a quiet bookstore that's closed that nobody can come in. We're doing the best we can. I know you guys all are too, to kind of get through this, but this helps make the time go by a little bit faster to talk about some great books with us. But for those of you who aren't familiar, Anderson's is an independent bookstore. We've been run and owned by the Anderson family for going on 6 generations. We're very proud of that. Our history with the community and our involvement with the community. And it also means that your support is very personal and appreciated by us. And we just like to take a minute to thank you for that. It means a lot to us. Normally, of course, we would be doing this in person along with over 400 other events during a year, but we'll take this for now so that we can still hear from some of our favorite authors in the meantime. We do have other events coming up on our calendar for all ages and interests. So you can take a look at our website, andersonsbookshops.com, to find the next one for you. We do have Joanne Tompkins coming. Jeffrey Eisner is going to be talking to us about Instant Pot recipes. Patrick Radden Keefe will be discussing his new book on the Purdue Pharma situation and that tragedy. And even Nigella Lawson's going to stop by and get us some good recipes as well. But tonight, we're so excited to celebrate the paperback release of Claire Lombardo's The Most Fun We Ever Had. So welcome, Claire. Claire earned her MFA in fiction at the Iowa Writers Workshop. And prior to writing The Most Fun We Ever Had, she spent several years doing social work in Chicago and born and raised in our backyard here in Oak Park, Illinois. And of course, Jennifer Weiner, a friend of Anderson's, and we've been lucky to have several times, is the #1 New York Times bestselling author of 17 books, 17 already, my gosh, including Big Summer, Mrs. Everything, the children's book, The Littlest Bigfoot, and an essay collection, Hungry Heart. A graduate of Princeton University and a contributor to New York Times opinion section. She lives in Philadelphia with her family, and her newest book, which is out next month in just a few weeks already, is called That Summer. So welcome to you both. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for having me as well.
I'll turn it over to you ladies for a conversation. As we keep going here, if anyone has a question, you can drop it in the chat and we'll get to that towards the end of our time together. So take it away.
So Claire, welcome. For those of you who don't know, Claire and I were Philadelphia neighbors for a hot minute, and I got to spend some time with Claire in person, and perhaps more importantly, her fabulous little dog, Renee, who some of you may know from social media. So the first question I have, and for those of you who have not read The Most Fun We Ever Had, this is a sprawling generational family saga that centers on the deep, soulful, and somewhat sickening love of David and Marilyn Sorensen, our long married protagonists. They have 4 daughters, Wendy, who is widowed, Violet, who has a big secret, Eliza, who is having relationship issues, and Grace, who's lying to her family about basically her entire life. So we follow the Sorensens through a year of seasons with many a flashback where we see births, we see deaths, we see weddings, and we understand how this family functions. So a lot of first novels are heavily autobiographical. Like, I will speak for myself. It is people tend to write thinly or even barely veiled versions of whatever they experienced as 20-somethings. And yet you wrote about this sort of older married couple, which is clearly not an experience that you personally had. So I'm wondering why this story and how this story, I mean, it must have been a challenge to write it as young as you were.
Yeah, that's a great question. You're also better at talking about my book than I am. So you could just come with me to all of these things. No, that's a really good question. I think I was, when I was writing stories prior to this novel, they did tend to be more, not autobiographical necessarily, but about people more in my demographic. But I just, and The Most Fun We Ever Had actually began as a story about Violet, one of the daughters. who was sort of closer in age and life experience to me, but her parents sort of crept in and I became sort of obsessed with them. And I really wanted I wanted to render a good relationship in a novel because there are so many fraught relationships in fiction. And so I kind of took it as a challenge. I really wanted to stick with this marriage that was really, really good at its core, even though it's, flawed and, they certainly have their struggles. But I also I felt the most comfortable when I was writing David and Marilyn in their points of view. I felt like, particularly Marilyn, she was just a voice that came easily to me and that was really fun to write. It was like being hugged or something. Maybe like, they're my own parents. But so yeah, I really wanted to just spend the span of a generation with these people. And David and Marilyn kind of became my points of fixation. Yeah.
It's interesting because I always think that writing happy people is a challenge because they don't want anything. And
Yes.
How do you sort of move the plot forward with two people who've already gotten the thing that they want? I mean, that's why the marriage plot's such a classic. It's like you've got people who are looking for their someone, and you've got a book where the people have already found their person. So talk about the daughters for people who haven't read the book. What do these women have going on?
Sure. So Wendy is the eldest daughter, and she's kind of a wild card. She is widowed, quite young, and kind of just has a rough go of things. Like she's just one of those people who bad things are more prone to happening to. And she's quite acerbic. She was also really fun to write. But she is has recently lost her husband and is just sort of existing or barely existing. And then Violet, who is 11 months younger than her, they're Irish twin, quote unquote Irish twins, is this kind of type A, tightly wound woman with a highly curated life on Chicago's North Shore, who has left her career as a corporate litigator, has two little kids and is at home full time, and sort of thriving in that environment, and not expecting the thing that happens to her to happen to her, which is that a child that I don't think I'm giving this away. You'll learn this on page like 30 if you haven't read the book, but a child that she has placed for adoption long ago when she was quite young resurfaces, and she as a teenager, and she wasn't expecting that. Liza is a psychologist, and she's a pretty young and pretty successful professor at the University of Illinois at Chicago, which is my alma mater. And she has a clinically depressed boyfriend who she doesn't know how to help, though she has this kind of arsenal of professional knowledge. And then Grace, as Jen said earlier, is lying about basically everything in her life. Nothing has turned out like she thought it would, or like she wanted it to. And so she is lying to her family about what she's doing and where she is. And she basically she doesn't know what she wants from the world. And so she's struggling a little bit and lives in a sort of terrifying apartment this is not an autobiographical novel, but Grace's apartment is modeled after an apartment that I once lived in. So that is the gamut of the Sorensen daughters.
And I mean, I'm assuming that all of them have pieces of you, whether it's, your apartment or your sense of humor or a relationship that you once had. Which one was the most challenging for you to get in touch with?
That's a really good question. Violet was the hardest for me. And it's funny because Violet is the character who started this novel. But I remember talking to my editor at Doubleday, and this was late in the game. Like we were on not our first round of edits. And she said, I don't really feel like I know who Violet is. And I was like, me either, even though I wrote the book and I'd spent 5 years writing it. And I think part of it is because Violet does have this veneer up, and it very rarely is off her. But she also Violet makes a lot of choices that are not easy to sympathize with. Violet has, she's not the warmest character, and she's not, she doesn't, and I get this reaction from readers a lot, like, God, I hated her. She was awful. And, but I think the amount of time that I spent with her and have spent with her since, I get kind of defensive because Violet is someone who has also been through a lot and is, just sort of barely hanging like holding it together, as are we all at different times in our lives. So I really had to spend some time with her and just sort of try to increase my empathy, which I now have a great deal of, and I'll happily defend her to book clubs and when I am yelled at about her. But yeah, she was a challenge at first.
So I'm sure a question you must get a lot. This is a novel about a family of four. You're one of a family of five. So, are people like, is this your family? Which one are you? And how did your family react to this book?
Yeah.
And talk as much or as little about that as you're comfortable talking.
Sure. No. Thankfully, it's a non-traumatic answer for the most part. No, so people do think almost all the time, and like you said, a lot of first novels are autobiographical. And I will say I did draw from my experience as a member of a large family. I've always been really interested in that dynamic as a participant and as a writer. But yes, people are constantly asking me which one I am, which one is my sister, sister X, Y, or Z. And I get the question of like, God, it was kind of cold that you killed your brother off. Why did you do that? Meanwhile, my brother, who's like a very private person, is like, thank you for not subjecting me to these kinds of questions. But so I come from I was actually the only woman in my family of my sisters who is not a creative writing major. All of my sisters are creative writers in some capacity or were. And so I thankfully was able to give them the book early on. And I gave it to one of my sisters first and just sort of said, take it, come back and tell me what you think. And she called me a couple of weeks later and she said, this isn't about our family. And she was like, I don't recognize anyone in this book. And I was like, no, I know. That was the point. So they thankfully, they've been very, very kind and very supportive. I got very lucky. My mom is also an incredibly supportive supporter of this book. She's read it multiple times and has endured her own book club asking her, is this you? Can we know more about what's going on? And yeah.
It's funny, because my mom has done some of the same things.
Yeah.
I wrote a book that was sort of very, very loosely based on her life. And Barnes and Noble chose it as their book club pick the month that it came out. And so my mom snuck into a Barnes and Noble in Farmington, Connecticut, and like sat in the book club and listened. And I'm like, why would you do that? Like,
oh,
and why would you not tell them who you were? And she's like, I just wanted to hear what people had to say. And I'm like, oh my God, like,
was it a good experience for her? Or was she...
I think that it was, but all I could think about was, you're probably too young, but there was a show called Hot or Not, where like people who wanted to be models would like submit their photographs, and like this like panel of experts would use laser pointers to circle their flaws and be like, you need to work on this. Like, I mean, to me, that it just must have, right?
Yeah, that's a nightmare. Yeah.
A nightmare. The last thing that I would ever want. But I mean, I feel like, most families, it's like, well, is this you? Is this your sister? Is this your mom? But I feel like you have the added issue of like, you were the only one who wasn't a creative writing major. And not only that, like you had a different career, which most writers I know, it's like, it goes like one of three ways, I feel like either they just go right to school to be writers and then they somehow become writers, or they teach writing at some level in some capacity, or they have some other kind of writing job, which was what I did. I was a newspaper reporter before I published my first novel. But like, you had a job, like you had a different career. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about your path to publication.
Sure. Yeah. I think my story is kind of a weird one. I mean, my story was a weird one in a lot of ways because I think I just made a lot of bad decisions in my early 20s.
That's what the 20s are for.
Right. Yeah. And mine were like fairly, they're like unsexy bad decisions. So I can say that. So I dropped out of college when I was 19. And I was working at a preschool, and the preschool I will also cop to this, the preschool in Most Fun is loosely based on the preschool in Oak Park where I worked. It was a miserable place and a miserable job. And while I was there, a friend of mine said, she was kind of worried about me. And she said, because I dropped out of school and I had this terrible job. And she was like, I want to introduce you to my old boss. And her old boss was a civil rights attorney. who worked at the Chicago Coalition for the Homeless. And so I went and I met Rini was my boss, who became my boss. I started volunteering there, and then their paralegal had left, so they needed someone to fill in. And I ended up staying there for, I think, 6 years. And then I stayed on in sort of different capacities, like volunteer, little like writing gigs and stuff. And at the time, I remember feeling like such a failure. Like, I couldn't make it through college, and I have this, this job where I'm not making enough money to like pay rent. And, I felt like this kind of, I was watching all my peers sort of be ferried along down the path, and I felt very sort of stunted. But it was such a transformative and like wonderful experience looking back. And I would not be, I don't think I would have written a novel if I hadn't done that. Because I was kind of the point person for our clients. So I was constantly on the phone with people who had lived lives that I could never have imagined. I grew up very comfortably in a sort of sheltered environment, and I was suddenly, just privy to the lives of all these other people, and it, increased my empathy thousandfold. But it also, I don't know, I think it made me, it satisfied the same part of me that is satisfied as a writer, which is just that I'm interested in other people's stories. So I was there, and then I went and finished college very, very quickly. I took 7 classes a semester so I could do it cheaply. And then I went to social work school as a graduate student, and started writing a novel at the same time. And then I dropped out of social work school too, $50,000 in debt later. Because I was working on this book, and I was going to class and I wasn't paying attention, and I was reading very theoretically about, different things that people go through in life, different traumas, different, just major events. And I was more interested in what would that actually look like for people on the page? So I dropped out. This is a really long story. I'm sorry.
No. I mean, I think that people are interested, and I think that everyone's path has a certain amount, I think unless you're Jonathan Safran Foer and you publish your college thesis when you're 23, right, and then every other writer hates you, right, there's a certain amount of meandering, because or else what are you going to write about? I think that yes, you kind of went to empathy boot camp in a way, and
totally,
whether or not those specific stories found their way into fiction, it's I think the shapes of stories don't change, or there's a lot of sort of they repeat, you see the same narratives kind of over and over and over, and you begin to understand them, and big questions, and why do people do what they do, why do women stay with bad guys, why are things with mothers and daughters so complicated, or daughters and fathers, or I think what you did helped you to answer those questions. Okay, so you're $50,000 in debt, and you've decided you're not going to be a social worker, and you go to Iowa, right? That's next.
Yes. Well, I was a nanny after that, which was also a miserable, terrible job. And then I was and then I was the PR coordinator for the National Flute Association, which I'm not saying flu like influenza, I'm saying flute like the woodwind instrument, which I do not play. It was another
wait. Back up. How?
We should talk about this the whole.
How? What happened?
So they had this incongruously fancy office on Lake Street and Michigan Avenue in Chicago, which listeners local will know that that's prime real estate. I don't know how they afford it, and everyone I worked with was lovely. I'm not slandering anyone, but the National Flute Association had a very fancy office that happened to be in a building where I used to work. And I saw the posting, and I was like, I need a job. And it was a writing job, and those can be hard to come by. And they offered health insurance. So I took it, and it was my job to, I did their social media. I handled PR crises,
wait. What constitutes a PR crisis in the world of the woodwinds? What happens?
I remember
start some shit, or what?
Well, the biggest day of my life there was, I think it was Jimmy Fallon made he made a joke about a famous flutist. It was like I don't remember the joke. It was something phallic. It was a pretty like logical comedic leap. And the flute community was up in arms because
that looked like when the flute community is up in arms?
I mean, it was not like that different than the flute community resting.
They're not up in arms.
It was nothing like terribly dramatic.
Why am I just hearing about this job now? Like, why are you not
told you this? It's like my claim to fame. It's like that and Renee are the only two interesting things about me.
Oh my God.
No, I sometimes wonder. I was talking to my sister a few weeks ago she said, she was like, I was just thinking about that job you had. Like, was that really your job? Like, it seemed too weird to be.
It does sort of feel like a front. Like you should be smuggling something.
I know. They had a lot of money.
Possibly.
Right? Flutes are expensive.
What does the National Flute Association do?
They advocate. God, I used to have our mission statement. I say as though I used to have the mission statement memorized. It's a professional It's like not dissimilar to the Authors Guild. You know, it's a sort of membership organization where I think you get some benefit from being part of it. They have a convention that I attended in DC. Yeah.
I am speechless. I'm speechless. Why is it? Are you going to write about this like someday?
I believe it did make it into Most Fun. I haven't read my own book in so long, but Grace does work at a Woodwind nonprofit just because I was like, that is, and I remember, I don't remember who it was at Doubleday, but someone was like, I don't believe that, that's too weird. Like we have to change that detail. And I was like, no, like I'm digging in my heels. Like,
but specifically the flute convention, like there has to be something to happen, like some kind of comedy of errors or like, you know, terrible hookup or just
I know a murder. Like I know something.
Wow. I mean, that is just a gift from the fiction gods. Like it
I know.
really is.
I know. Maybe it's a short story. I don't know. Something has to
happen. Like let that percolate because like that's just too good not to do something with.
Right? Thank you.
But somehow you find it in you to leave this job and go to Iowa.
Yes.
With your 813 page manuscript. Yes.
Which I think back now and I'm just like, if I had met myself at Iowa, I would have hated, like, because who wants to be the person who comes in being like, hey guys, here's my tome that I've been working on quiet, like, you know, it was just like a really obnoxious person to be. I tried not to be obnoxious, but
I did not get an MFA. Like, were you the only person to show up with like a completed work? Like, that can't be that.
No, I think I was just the person whose work was like 4 times as long as it was supposed to be.
Okay, yeah. Well, I understand.
Yeah. I had sort of a refuge. I'm I'm long-winded in my speech too, but I'm a long-winded story writer. And I had come in with this essentially like manifesto, which is, you know, in some ways
nailed it to like Ethan Kane
right.
or something like that. Great.
It showed up at, that was how it went. Yeah.
So, but how did it go? I mean, because how does it work there? Like there's workshops, there's professors, there's other students, and you're supposed to be critiquing each other. Like, is it terrible and vicious and mean?
No, not when I was there. I can't say what happened in the years following because I've heard stories, but I feel like the year I was there and the class above me was like the kindest group of people that you could ever ask for. I feel so lucky. I didn't feel that there was a lot of competition. I felt it was a very fostering, and like I feel such like so warmly towards all of my classmates. And those couple of years, it was just a really lovely, you know, and I was terrified when I got there because I had heard these horror stories. And I had a couple of, you know, not great workshops, but even though, I mean, they were humanely not great and they were, you know, critical. So that's what you want. So no, I found it a really just lovely experience. And again, I can't speak for what happened after that, but no, I got really lucky, and I found a lot of great readers. A lot of my friends had books, you know, come out within a couple weeks of me, which was really, really fun. So yeah, it was, I feel very, very positively about it there, or about my time there.
And that's where you found your agent, yes?
Yes. So agents cycle through the workshop. When I was there, I think like 4 or 5 would come a year and meet with students. And I was also terrified to meet my agent, because I mean, she's been around for a while and has, you know, sort of a reputation. And I just remember feeling like I'm gonna die, like I'm gonna go into this meeting and just die. And she was so nice, like she was, you know, incredibly lovely. And I remember we talked about Alice Munro, and like we had this lovely conversation. And so yeah, I met, I have 2 agents, they work together, so I met both of them there, which was, you know, also sort of an unsexy story. That's how I met my agent, but because I know that people go through, you know, grueling querying processes, so I was lucky to not have to do that. But yeah, so I met them there, and then the December after I graduated, I sold my book. So yeah, it was a really fruitful time.
No, that's great. And you know, it's nice to hear a story like that, because for a lot of people it is like super duper grueling. Like they'll have, you know, for those of you who don't know, like they'll have it's possible to write a novel and have an agent interested enough in that novel to take you on as a client, and have that novel never sell, you know. And so then you've got an agent, but you don't have a book, and then you have to sort of write another book, and you know, sometimes that's the one that sells, sometimes it's the one after that that sells. So it's nice to hear about it just sort of like going so beautifully and so smoothly.
Yeah.
So I want to back up and ask you what kind of reader you were as a kid, like, because even though, you know, you worked as a social worker, even though you had like, you know, you were in school for social work and you had this like wonderful flute people job, but like, it's like, you know, you were growing up a writer, whether you knew it or not. So like, who did you read?
Ooh, well, this is actually a funny story because my very first book signing that I went to was at Anderson's. And I think I was 10, and Anna and Martin, who were at the Babysitters Club, was signing books, and my mom took me. I loved the Babysitters Club. I loved Sweet Valley. I had just all of those sort of serial, I devoured those. I was an incredibly voracious, like I would essentially read anything, but I really liked those kind of, you know, I like to read the stuff that I like to read now, which is just about people in spaces moving around and having like hijinks. That's kind of my,
Right.
my fictional milieu. But yeah, and I think too, like because I have older sisters who were all big readers too, I was exposed to writers who I probably wouldn't have been exposed to until much later at an early age. So Lori Moore and Jeffrey Eugenides, I was reading books that were probably beyond my maturity level or comprehension, or I don't know, when I was quite young, which I consider a real gift.
I feel like that happens in large families because there's like only so much attention that the parents have, and it's kind of
Yes.
spread amongst the children. So like I was reading like crazy stuff. Like I look back and I'm like, who the hell gave me Portnoy's complaint when I was 11? But the answer was like it was on the bookshelf, and like nobody
Yeah.
was paying attention. Like there was a baby in the house. Like that was where
Right.
the attention was going. And so like nobody, you know, as long as I wasn't like causing trouble or starting fires, you know, it's like
Just reading Philip Roth.
reading Philip Roth.
Yeah, yeah.
I have this theory that I wanted to ask you, which is like, because I know a lot of authors, and I seem to know like a lot of them who come from families of 4 or 5 or even more than that. Like, do you think that there's something specific to like growing up in a large family? Like, is it like that you see so much drama because there's lots of people, or, you know, you're allowed to sort of like go your own way because there's not that much attention? Like, I don't know. I'm
Maybe
working on
so.
it.
You're one of 4, correct?
One of 4, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, I think all the things you just said are probably true. And I don't know, having to learn at a young age how to navigate around other people.
Yes.
And
Yes.
how to, like you know, like you said a couple minutes ago, having to learn like, oh, the attention's going to be siphoned over here now because this person needs our parents more than like you kind of have to, you learn that you're not the most important person in the world, I think earlier, maybe.
Yeah.
So that could help. I don't know that, and that could maybe increase interest in story. I don't know. It's an interesting theory.
I think that's, I don't know, that's my idea, is that like you're privy to drama, like just by nature of like different personalities that are all living under one roof. And so, you know, at least for me, like I feel like I became a novelist because I wanted to understand like why people do what they do, why they choose what they choose, why they choose who they choose. You know, and those are all questions that you answer in fiction. So I want to ask about Renee. For those of you who do not know Renee, Renee is Claire's better half.
I'm gonna get her.
Oh, go get her. This is exciting, you guys. I was telling Ginny before the event began that like I met Claire because she lived in Philadelphia briefly, and when I met her, that was awesome and everything. But when I met Renee, I was like, I am having a star sighting. Like I got all flushed and excited. I was like, oh my God, it's Renee. Because, you know, Renee is like a Twitter character and she is adorable. And she's
the best.
Oh, hello, friend.
She says hello.
So tell the story of Renee.
Oh, the story of Renee is the greatest story ever told.
It is. It's beautiful.
Hi, buddy. Good girl. Yeah. So I got Renee at a shelter in Philly. Renee's my very good thing to come from my move to Philly and my friendship with you.
Yeah.
I went to a shelter to get Renee, not to get Renee, to meet the dogs. And there were 3 dogs named, oh gosh, the other 2, Renee's name was Tinsel. It was right before Christmas. And there were 2 other tiny dogs named Krampus and Dreidel.
Okay. Just working a theme. I see.
Yes. And they were Krampus and Dreidel were both men, obviously. Right. They were introduced to me as either Renee's children or lovers, and I was just like, oh God. So Renee was in like an animal hoarding situation, and
she was in a thruple. Was she in a thruple?
I know. I don't know what was going on. It like breaks my heart to think about it. I know.
Oh,
like,
no.
But so Krampus was her son, and Krampus was like Renee, but with like long hair. So I was like, Krampus is the dog for me. And all the while when I was meeting this dog, there was this little tiny face watching me. And I went back and got Renee. She's lovely. She's staring at me. She's been such a great companion to have during the pandemic. I mean, she's a great companion regardless, but it's so nice to watch your dog is a rescue as well, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's so nice to watch them come from, whatever their circumstances were, and then see them get comfortable in their spaces and their bodies, and I learned what foods she likes, and because she's not like riddled with anxiety all the time. So Renee is the best. Renee got a staircase. I don't know if I told you that. I got her a little tiny staircase so she could I'm just gone like full crazy. Well, anyway, Renee just ascended her staircase and is now watching me.
Oh, I love that so much. My mom and her wife got like the last pandemic dog in all of New England.
I think you told me this. Yeah.
He's such a good boy. His name is Lincoln, and he looks like a resty, but he was just a mess when they got him. He was like all skinny, and his fur was all matted, and he had like fleas, and it was just like, he was tied up under a bridge, and it was just like this tragedy.
Oh God.
And now he is just like this like jaunty little fellow who just like goes around their house like boop 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 boop, but he's terrified of my dog. Like, so Moochie, of course, is a fancy lady, and she has like special like hypoallergenic kibbles because she's allergic to stuff. And so we were on Cape Cod this summer, my mom and Claire and Lincoln and me and Moochie. And so I would feed Moochie in my room so that like her kibble was someplace else, because Lincoln like was food insecure, I'm sure. So he gets like half a cup of food twice a day, and he just like snarfs it, he like inhales it, and then just looks everywhere for more. But he would sneak into Moochie's room and like take her kibbles. And one day I like caught him in the act, and I'm like, Lincoln. And he looks at me with this like horrible expression of guilt, and he opens his mouth and the kibbles come spilling onto the floor and he runs away.
Oh my God.
I'm like, okay, buddy, you can have those. Like, but she's like, oh my God, like what is even happening with this guy?
Right.
But loser. But back to the book. So the most fun we ever had got a new cover for the paperback. I wanted to ask you about that because kind of describe the two covers. Unless, do you have copies of the book?
Well, yes, I have the paperback right here. Do I have this is where I see if I have my own book on my bookshelves. I don't. I should, but yeah. So this is the
ginkgo leaves, right? It's leaves.
Yes, and the spine of this actually has ginkgo. Well, you can't see it because of my weird lighting. You know, you can kind of see them.
Right there, they are. Yeah.
But the hardcover is it's actually very pale blue with 4 ginkgo leaves. So quite aesthetically different. But as we were saying before we got on with everyone, they seem to be in conversation with each other.
It's the same designer you mentioned.
Yes.
Same person who did both covers, but like, did they talk to you at all about like the why of it? Because, you know, it seems to me the book was so successful with the cover that they gave it as a hardcover that they would have sort of stuck with that, but they went
I'm trying to remember. There was some rationale that was more articulately explained to me than I'm going to explain right now, but something about the sparseness of the art on the first one not translating well to a paperback.
Interesting.
Yeah. And I mean, this looks to me more like, I have it, well, it's my hope, and I think this was part of the rationale too. This is a book that you might pick up if people who saw The Most Fun We Ever Had in hardcover and thought, this looks really long and heavy and I'm not going to pick it up. This seems like a slightly less imposing read. I'm encouraging Moochie to, if I can do anything.
Oh, is it Moochie? Is good girl.
Oh, hi, buddy. Oh my God. That little face.
There I am. Yes, where I should be. You know, it's an interesting question of control, because I think that people assume that like we get to pick out the covers, we have the final say over everything, and the fact is, like, I don't feel like we have final say over a whole lot, you know. Like, it's just it's interesting. Like my my upcoming book that summer had a different title when it was a work in progress, and my publisher was really you know, they felt very, very strongly that the word summer needed to be in the title. And I was pushing back a little bit. And then they were like, you know, we know the marketplace. And I'm like, well, I guess, you know, it's their job to know the marketplace. And who am I to, you know, say? But so can you tell us what you're working on now?
Sure. I'm working on another novel. That was actually the project that I was primarily writing when I was at Iowa. At the time, it was a short story collection, and now it is not anymore. Now it is a novel.
Like a character in one of the stories that started like speaking to you more? Is that?
No, well, it was going to be linked stories. So it's a, I'll say very, I don't want to jinx it, is what I was going to say, which is a stupid thing to say. It's a novel about a marriage. Also, it's a very different marriage than David and Marilyn's, but I was writing these, you know, these linked stories about this couple and kind of different, you know, different points in their relationship trajectory. And then as I kept working on it, it was kind of like just, you know, the style that each of the stories was written, it was sort of like, this is kind of a novel anyway. So, and people buy novels more than story collections, unfortunately. But I love short stories. It's like my favorite fictional form. I adore them and I love writing them. But
I just reread Olive again this summer, you know, the Olive Kitteridge books, and then Olive again, and like they're wonderful. And
I just pulled it off my shelf to reread. Yeah, I haven't done it yet.
Oh, good. But I'm kind of like, well, is this a novel in stories, or is it like linked stories? Because, so, you know, they're told in the voices of different characters, but there's a cohesion to them, and they're so good. Anyhow,
I think that book, I think they just didn't call it anything. I think that was one of the ones where it's not Olive Kitteridge a novel, or, you know, I think they snuck it under the
maybe it just had a sticker on it, and that was it. It's like, you know, Olive
that does the trick.
An Oprah book.
Right.
But so I'm sure we have lots of questions. I'm sure there are many things that people want to ask you about first novels and second novels and MFAs and flutes. So
Right.
Ginny, I see, is back, and she has so let's see what people want to.
Yeah, let's have it. I mean, I do as a child woodwind player, I am very interested in what the flute society has to say. I feel like
Right?
as a clarinetist, I should like wage war of some sort.
Right.
Like that could be like, who needs West Side Story when you can have clarinets and flutes fighting? But anyway,
Yeah.
right. That is really fascinating. And I love these events when you find out those little interesting tidbits of the hidden talents or past jobs or really interesting things. So thank you for that. All right. Well, everybody's very excited to see both dogs. So thank you both for bringing them on screen because I think that made all of our nights. Here's a question for Claire. Do you have an update on the show? Are you involved in the production at all?
I really don't have an update on the show. I wish I had something really illustrious to say. Keep your fingers crossed. That is my my greatest update. I hope to be involved, moving forward. But particularly in the last year, everything has, either stalled or dramatically slowed down for obvious reasons. So I'll keep you posted. But yeah.
Well, that's a really interesting thing that a lot of people don't know is that when an author sells rights that way, there's varying levels of participation. And Jen, you can obviously speak quite clearly to that.
Yeah, I had no level of participation when In Her Shoes was made into a movie. And I just got like super duper lucky that they did such a good job with it because the way that it was explained to me, and at that point I had only written 2 books, and they basically said, like, unless you're Stephen King and, are somebody who's like a ginormous bestseller and a big name and somebody with a lot of power, like it's better to just, let go and let God. And I just sort of told myself that, like, no matter what happens with this adaptation, like, even if I hate it, even if they change every single thing about it, like, the book is still the book, and the book will still be on the shelves in bookstores, and nobody will take a word of that away. And maybe even a bad adaptation will bring more people to my book. And it was a really, really respectful adaptation. The only issue that I had with it, and I tell people this story all the time, is that for those of you who read In Her Shoes, you know that one of the protagonists was a plus size woman, right? And in Hollywood, it's like you just can't seem to make that happen, or at least you couldn't in like the early aughts. And so they cast Toni Collette, and I was so excited because she had sort of had her breakout in a movie called Muriel's Wedding, where she gained like 40 pounds. So I'm like, well, she'll do that again, like, because who wouldn't, right? If given the opportunity to do so. And I remember like getting calls, like getting updates from Hollywood, and they're like, she had just finished making a movie, like a small independent movie, and she played a grieving widow, and she was basically like emaciated. And so they're like, she's gained 10 pounds. And I'm like, that's great. Like we're off to a good start. And then they're like, okay, she's gained 12 pounds. And I'm like, is there a problem? Like, what is happening out there? Like, do they need me to come explain donuts or something like that? Like, and then they're like,
I volunteer as tribute, right? Like
exactly, right? Like, what's the problem here? And then they're like, okay, she's gained 15 pounds, but she's hit a wall. And I'm like, what wall are you people talking about? Like, there's no wall. I have not discovered a wall. And I'm like, 15 pounds, like, that's a good weekend for some of us.
Doing it wrong.
Exactly. So I so wish that she'd been bigger. And that was the one thing I would have changed, but it was really like the only thing I would have changed. Like, I was so happy with how they did it. And like my Nana got to be an extra, which was huge. And I was like I was the favorite grandchild for like a minute. And then Cousin Rachel had a baby and I wasn't anymore, but it worked out. It was,
you had your moment.
I wish this happiness for everyone. But the thing with adaptations is like, it's just so hard. And I think a lot of people assume that like when something gets optioned, it's like, great, when do I look for it in the theaters? And they don't understand that there's like a lot of steps and a lot of things that can happen. And that the most common thing is like something gets optioned and the option expires without anything happening, or something gets optioned and there's a script but the director doesn't like it, and then the star gets busy doing something else, and then the option expires. I mean, there's like a million and one things that can go wrong. It's like a miracle if anything actually makes it onto the screen. But there was Bridgerton, and there was Little Fires Everywhere, and there's definitely there's been some stuff. So we can hope. So keep a good thought for the most fun we ever had.
Absolutely. Well, and that leads me to a different question too. There's a lot of things I think that people think that authors have control over that they don't actually, like the covers you were talking about earlier, or even the titles sometimes, or the film rights. What are some of the things, Jen is as a 17 book career so far, and Claire, with the one you've got and the one you're working on, what are the things that surprised you about this whole process? Or Jen, is there anything that still surprises you?
I am surprised, like on the daily. What is a surprising thing or something that I didn't know?
Yeah, so there are things that readers think that you are in control of that you're not.
Well, I mean, I'll tell you, I think that like anybody who's ever seen a book tour as depicted in a movie or on TV, like, I had seen, I think, Carrie Bradshaw's book launch on Sex and the City, right? Where it's just like this huge affair, this like blowout thing, and there's everybody there, and they're all famous, and they're all beautiful, and they're all dressed up. And I go to like my first book event, and there's like two people, and one of them is the bookstore manager, and the other one is homeless and just there for like the cheese. And this is what happened to me.
They had food at least.
They sent me on a 12-book tour, and like, I remember one city, like this terrified looking woman comes up to me. She's like, "Your mother said she'd kill me if I didn't come, so please tell her that I came." I'm like, "Okay, all right, you're off the hook, Julie." But I think that you expect a degree of like glitz and glamour that just like isn't there a lot of the time. Like, what have you found, Claire?
Yeah, I mean, I that was sort of my experience. I was just sort of surprised. I'm still surprised that like anyone has ever read my book. So I think to like have the one person in the corner who is not there on purpose is still exciting.
Right?
But yeah, it is way different. But yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think like my sort of expectation versus reality in that respect. It was fun. This has been I wasn't expecting there to be a global pandemic. And for my book tour to be virtual, that's a different thing. But it also, it's been a nice way to, like, I don't know that Jen and I would have been able to get together, like, were we not all on Zoom. So there are nice perks.
Yes,
yeah,
for sure.
other things I didn't expect. Just how much decision making there is into like that goes into making a book come out. Also, copy editors are the greatest people on the whole earth. I had the most wonderful, Ellen Feldman is her name, at Random House, and I got this manuscript, the most fun manuscript back, and I have never had someone read my writing with that degree of specificity, and she was so like, that street actually in 1999, it didn't extend all the way to Grand Avenue. Like it was insane and so helpful. And I remain just so grateful for that. And so the fact that things like that happen when you're publishing a book was a complete surprise to me.
Yeah. All right, here is another question from our chat from Katie. She would love to hear more about, Claire, your decision to apply for MFAs and what the application process was like.
Oh, sure. It was really expensive. That is my first. I had this weird little savings account that my father had started for me when I was a teenager. And I think it had $700 and something in it. And I cashed it out and used that money to apply to, I think, 12 MFA programs. So that's my first piece of information. But it was, I kind of decided I'm just going to do this. I'm going to go all in. And if I don't get in, I'll just go back to social work school. And I tell my students now, I make my students take an oath at the beginning of every semester, which is that they will not go into debt for an art degree. And I say this as someone who teaches in the arts and believes in them fervently, and more than most things in the world. Don't pay hundreds of thousands of dollars to get a writing degree. You don't technically need one. As Jen can attest to, you don't need an MFA to be a writer, to be an incredibly successful writer. So that is something to bear in mind. But I knew, I wanted sort of a soft place to land. I didn't have any kind of fiscal safety net. So I was just sort of like, I'm going to see if someone will pay my rent for 2 years while I work on a book. And that was such a great gift. But my advice for people applying to MFA programs, I don't have a lot of great advice except submit your best work, your best pages. And that doesn't always mean your entire novel or all the pages. If there's 10 pages in your 813 page manuscript that are outstanding, submit those, because the people who are reading them, and I say this having been the person who's reading them sometimes, they're not going to be impressed that you've, submitted 100 pages instead of 30 if the 100 pages aren't all great. Those are my brief pieces of advice.
No, that's great. And Jen, on your side, from coming from a different path to get to the success that you've had, what is your advice for aspiring authors?
Honestly, I think that Claire had the right idea. I think go get a job. And I think like the more interesting job, the better. And the less glamour involved, the better. Like, I feel like there are people who actually like go get jobs with the purpose of like, well, I know I'm really a writer and I'm going to write about this someday. So I'll go work as a cocktail waitress, or
Yes,
I'll go work the line in like a fancy schmancy restaurant in New York City. So my first job out of college was I was a reporter for a small daily newspaper in central Pennsylvania. And one of my jobs was typing in the school lunch menus for 5 school districts every Monday. And it kind of killed me at first. Like, I mean, I had taken classes with Joyce Carol Oates and I had taken classes with Toni Morrison. And there I am sitting typing like hot dog in bun, tater tots, your choice of chocolate or skim milk, and carrot sticks. And I'm like, what happened? Like, it was bad. I mean, I felt like the F. Scott Fitzgerald just got knocked right out of me. But I spent 2.5 years. And then I went to a medium-sized paper and spent like 10 months there. And then I went to a big paper and spent like 4 years there before my first book came out. So like, the idea of like 10,000 hours to master something like wasn't yet in vogue. But when that theory came out, I was like, I counted up the hours that I had spent being a journalist. And I was like, yeah, it's like 10,000 hours. But I learned to write on deadline. I learned to work with editors. I learned to write to fit, which is like, if you've got 10 inches for a story, you've got to write a 10-inch story. It can't be 12 inches. It can't be 18. You can't make your editor have to do the work of cutting it. You've got to like write it for that space, which taught me to be like very precise and very intentional about like what details and quotes are really going to tell the story, which is something that novelists have to think about all the time. Like, what are the details I'm going to use to describe this character that's going to tell my readers who she is? Or like, what is the one quote that I have room for here that's going to like really move this scene forward? So, and for years, people would ask me like, what is your advice for aspiring writers? And I'd say, go get a job at a small daily paper. And unfortunately, I feel like those jobs no longer exist and those papers no longer exist. And like, I don't know how I would feel about telling somebody to go like work for BuzzFeed and like write listicles, but like, I feel like that's the equivalent of the job that I had in my 20s now, is working for a website or something like that. So, but I think that anything that gets you writing, whether you're writing on your own, in your spare time, whether you're writing because it's your job and you're writing press releases about flutes, or you're writing school menus, or like whatever it is, like, I think the practice of writing and just the like training yourself physically to know that like when you sit your butt in the seat and you put your hands on the keyboard, like then it's time to work. And you're not going to like screw around and check social media and shop all day long.
Right. Right.
And
or
also,
you're going to learn to multitask really well.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Okay, a real technical question here from Iris. Why did you write in third person narrative for this novel?
Me?
I'm going to guess so.
Okay. Why? I love the third person. I have an aversion that I can't explain to the first person, not reading it, but writing it. I just struggle with it. Though for like a decade, that was all I wrote. But I do think a really close third person, which is what the most fun we ever had is written in, can do the exact same work as a first person. And so it just made more sense in a novel that has 7 perspectives. I kind of got to maintain an authorial sort of tone overall, but I could dip into when we're in Wendy's head, she's going to swear a lot, or when we're in, Violet's head, Violet will use a 4-syllable word when she could easily use a 1-syllable. You can kind of futz with the actual nuance of their speech. But I'm partial to the third person. Do you have a preference, Jen? Do you like?
I think it kind of depends on the book and the character.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I think that if I look over like my body of work, my God, I can't believe I just said that, but like I think that I would find that I tend to write younger women in the first person and older women who are more my age in the third person. I don't know why that is. I mean, I think they both can work, and it sort of depends, what kind of story you want to tell. And definitely if you've got 7 protagonists, I think like if you had one person who was the I of the story and everybody else was the she or the he, that would be like choosing sides almost, or playing favorites. So I don't know that there was another way that Claire could have written that book. I don't know.
Yeah, it's an interesting question.
So Jen, that leads me to a question I have from what you mentioned about writing differently depending on the age of your character and the age that you as the author are. And knowing that earlier you guys talked about your families and yourselves and how that impacts your own writing. And that's a question that I overhear a lot at author things is, oh, how much of you is in this book, or how much of your family is in this book? I'm curious as to your thoughts. Do you think you would get those questions if you were men?
Wow, that is a great question. And I think the answer is probably a lot less, because I think that people read fiction by women and assume that all we've done is sort of dip the dipper into the well of our own past.
Right.
Sort of
we can only write what we've experienced, right?
That on page, as opposed to like actually doing the work of creating characters and creating situations. And I wonder also if like third person gives you more authority. It lets you write from a position of more omniscience, and that gives you more heft almost to your voice. But yeah, I mean, I do absolutely think that there's still that bias that people that assume that when they're reading something by a woman, it must be something that she herself has personally experienced or done. Which is why it's like fun to read a book by a woman that's about cannibalism, which I'm certainly hoping, for example, that the author of this book I just read, A Certain Hunger, like didn't actually like eat her ex-boyfriend. But I think that's one way to obviate that preconception, is just to write about something that there's no way you could have done.
Right. Well, and Claire, you mentioned you have a large family as well. And, if one of your brothers had written something like that, do you think you'd get the same kind of a question? What are your thoughts on that?
I don't. And I think also like, and Jen has, I think, said more about this historically than I have, but men get more credit for writing the types of like if a man had written The Most Fun We Ever Had, he would get a lot more credit and I've gotten plenty of credit. I'm not, but men get more credit for emotional nuance. Like it's, there's, which I don't know, it's not answering your question necessarily, but I'm thinking about that as
I think it's an interesting, like, I think you're right. They get more credit for it because I think there's an assumption that they had to work harder to put the emotion in it. Right. Yeah. Whereas women didn't, because that's all we know. Right. Like,
yeah.
I mean, I don't know if I don't mean to sound as a super critical question of anything, but I think it's really interesting, especially with family oriented books, that perspective that people bring to it.
Yeah, I mean, I do think like I'm thinking about, sort of the books that would fall under the category of domestic realism that are written by men that are just like so celebrated and so revered, and because everybody assumes that it was like a tremendous amount of work for Jeffrey Eugenides to get into the head of a female protagonist in the marriage plot, for example. And poor Jeffrey Eugenides got sort of dragged through the coals because somebody found a quote where, his female protagonist was talking about, in the wake of a breakup and saying, even her breasts look depressed. And somebody was saying, like, Jeffrey, like, boobs don't droop depending on your mood. Like, that's not how bodies work. But
it's not a dog's tail, right? Like, it just
exactly. But like, I mean, that shit won the National Book Award, and it's like,
right.
I don't even know what to say about that.
Right,
exactly.
right.
Other than, if I had, any sort of droopy body part, I'm sure I would get pilloried for that. It's like,
well, that's why I think critical reading skills, and I know, Jen, you've written for children, and Claire, maybe that's down your road sometime, and maybe it's not, I don't know, but teaching kids to read critically that way, to know who the author is and what their background is and how that impacts what they've written is so interesting. I'm reading a young adult novel to my 6th grader right now, and we're laughing because it happens to be a male author, and all of a sudden there's this love interest, and my sixth grader's like, what is that all about? And I'm like, yeah, no, nobody talks about it like that. You can just tell. But to know that background, I think, is really interesting. But that's also why these events are so valuable for readers, to see the people behind where it came from, and to hear the background of your stories, and to know, what's an influence from your own life and what isn't, and how both of those are very valuable, and create a more complete and beautiful book. So thank you to both of you for that. I think we've hit most of the questions in the chat. So I don't know if you guys either of you have anything you want to kind of wrap up with before we go on for the rest of our evenings, or?
I just want to encourage anybody who hasn't read The Most Fun We've Ever Had to pick it up, because it is marvelous and engrossing, and I think has a lot to say about marriage and about families. And I can't think of any reader who wouldn't find something in that story that resonated, with his or her own memories about, families and marriage and siblings.
Absolutely.
The sibling piece of it was what got me, but I think that there's just something there for everyone. So Claire, congratulations on all the success that the book has had so far, and all of the success that I'm sure it's going to have in its new incarnation with its new lovely cover. And thank you for coming tonight.
Thank you so much for coming. Yeah, thank you for chatting with me, Jen. Thank you for having me. This was really fun. Thank you, guys.
Congratulations again.
Yes,
Thank
congratulations, Claire, on the paperback, and Jen, we look forward to your new book next month as well. And I know it feels like a whole nother thing, right? And for anyone who purchased a copy of the book as part of your event tonight, thank you so much for that. We will get that out to you. You'll get an email from us when that is ready for pickup or to be shipped out. Just so you know, we do have other signed copies available, so you'll get an email about that as well, with a link if you would like to purchase additional copies. Makes a great gift. We got Mother's Day coming up. We got Father's Day coming up. I think, Jen, you hit a nail on the head. This was a staff favorite of ours, and I think it was so easy to hand sell because there was something in it for everyone. It was very broad that way, and that made it that, and the local connection too. Always, that's always a big thing for us as well. So thank you both for your time. Thank you everyone else for being here tonight. We appreciate it. Happy reading, everybody. Stay safe out there. We're almost to the end. I know we're almost there. All right, be safe, everybody. Good night.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.